Another big story this morning. The United Arab Emirates and Israel have agreed to normalise relations. The deal brokered by Washington includes a promise by Israel to delay the annexation of Palestinian lands in the West Bank. The Palestinians, though, have reacted angrily, with the Israeli Prime Minister saying eventual annexation is still on the cards.
There is no change in my plan to implement our sovereignty in Judea and Samaria in full coordination with the United States. I'm committed to it. It's still on the table.
Palestinian leadership rejects what the United Arab Emirates has done and considers it a betrayal of Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa and the Palestinian cause.
However, some suspect the deal between the UAE and Israel actually targets another regional player, as Caleb Mopin explains.
Israel and the United Arab Emirates have formally agreed to establish diplomatic ties. Now, many see this as a historic move, as for many years Arab states have not recognized Israel as a country.
This is a monumental step to forging ties of cooperation in the Middle East.
Donald Trump's supporters say he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for arranging this. But the Palestinians aren't exactly thrilled with this new arrangement.
The deal between United Arab Emirates and Israel is a betrayal of the Palestinians, given the historical relationship that Israel has had with the Arab states. In other words, no peace, according to the old formula, no peace was possible until the Palestinian issue was resolved. And the Palestinian issue is not resolved.
The Palestinian Authority is now formally withdrawing its envoy from the United Arab Emirates. They say recognizing a country that is occupying them is simply unacceptable. Now, in the diplomatic fallout of this deal, we're starting to see what this is really all about. Aside from the UAE, Israel, and the United States, there is a fourth country that's now showing up in a lot of the conversation surrounding the deal: Iran.
Peace between the Arabs and the Israelis is Iran's worst nightmare, and no one has done more to intensify the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis than Iran. What we see today is a new Middle East. The trend lines are very different today, and we see the future is very much in the Gulf and with Israel, and the past is with the Iranian regime. It clings to power on the basis of brute force.
Iran, often labeled as Israel's largest regional opponent, has denounced the deal.
The Islamic Republic of Iran is confident that history will show that this was a mistake made by Israel, and this dagger that has been unjustly thrust by the United Arab Emirates into the backs of the Palestinian people and all Muslims will lead to strengthening resistance and the unity of the Muslim people against Israel, as well as fuel confrontation in the region.
When Donald Trump visited Saudi Arabia, he spoke of building an Arab NATO that would work as a coalition in the region opposing Iran and fighting terrorism. And it seems now this historic deal is being revealed not so much to be about getting recognition for Israel or protecting Palestinians from annexation, but about targeting one of Washington's most long-standing opponents in the region.
There is definitely the antagonism toward Iran, and I think the timing is ideal given what's happening in Beirut and the fact that Hezbollah is now under pressure in Lebanon with the government having resigned there. So we have a coalition building. This agreement, rather than easing tensions in the Gulf within the Arab states, will harden stances or at least continue to maintain the antagonism that we have.
Anders Lee's interview with Norman Finkelstein.
Mr. Finkelstein, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted to begin by asking about recent developments, or non-developments, if you will, in Israel. At the start of the summer, Prime Minister Netanyahu had planned to annex a large portion of the occupied West Bank beginning on July 1st. But so far, Israel hasn't executed on this. Why do you think that is?
I think there are probably two reasons. Reason number one, because there are a lot of domestic developments now unfolding in Israel, which have distracted the Prime Minister, whether it be his handling of the COVID crisis or his current legal problems. I think that's one factor. The other factor is that there's a case pending in the International Criminal Court regarding Israel's crimes in the West Bank and Gaza, West Bank including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And we're right now waiting for a critical decision by what's called a pretrial chamber in this case. And if Netanyahu now goes ahead with an annexation, it will almost certainly result in the criminal court launching an investigation of Israeli crimes. So I think he's, my guess, it's pure speculation, I would want to add, my guess is that on the foreign affairs front, as distinct from the domestic front, on the foreign affairs front, he's right now anxiously awaiting that ICC decision.
Well, speaking of the ICC, your most recent book entitled I Accuse is about the International Criminal Court. I was wondering if you could give us some insight as to how the ICC avoids investigating Israel for international law violations.
Well, it's a very complicated technical situation right now, and I'm not sure how amenable it is to a interview-type explanation. I'll try to as best as I can, and you can stop me when you begin to get bored by the technicalities. I'll try as best as I can to convey the picture. There are currently two, not one, but two what are called situations before the International Criminal Court. The first situation refers back to the Israeli assault in May 2010 on the humanitarian convoy that was en route to Gaza, and that left 9 passengers immediately dead, and a 10th passenger died later on. The ICC chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, dismissed the situation, the referral it's called, dismissed the referral on the grounds that it was of insufficient gravity to warrant an ICC investigation. There are several stages in an ICC sequence. First is the preliminary examination. Second is the investigation. Third is the indictment. And fourth is the trial with or without a conviction. The two cases before the ICC have not yet gone beyond the preliminary examination. There's a second one, the one that was referred by what's called the State of Palestine. And that refers to Israeli crimes in the West Bank focused on the settlements, and Israeli crimes in Gaza focused on the death and destruction during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Here, the chief prosecutor, for reasons I won't go into now unless you're curious, she switched sides. Instead of supporting Israel, she's now supporting the Palestinians. And this case, you asked, how do you get around an ICC investigation, especially given the magnitude of Israeli crimes? And here's where you get into technicalities. The ICC is not a universal court. It's based on jurisdiction being delegated to the court by states. So a state may, for example, go to the ICC and say, we have a situation here, and we'd like you to investigate whether war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, genocide have occurred here. Or a state can join the ICC and then make a referral based on a situation of that state. The emphasis in everything I've said just thus far is state. And now the question has come before the court, is Palestine a state? If it's not a state, it can't make a referral. And the second related question is, what are the borders of this state? Because the ICC, even if it has jurisdiction, that is to say, a state requested it to exercise jurisdiction, the question then is, jurisdiction over what territory? If a crime committed in a area that was not within the state's jurisdiction, then it can't refer that crime to the ICC. So the question is, what is the territory of this state? And that's where matters currently stand. And the chief prosecutor said, it's my considered opinion that Palestine is a state. It's also my considered opinion that the territory of that state is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. However, I recognize that at least the second aspect, namely the territory, is controversial. Israel, as you know, claims these are not Palestinian territories, but disputed territories. So she says, I'll let the pretrial chamber, which is basically the court, I'll let the court, the judges, I'll let them decide. So she kicked the ball into the PTC, the pretrial chamber, and right now the decision will probably come at the end of August. We'll hear what the what the pretrial chamber decides, whether there is a definable territory, and also the PTC may decide to weigh in on the question, is Palestine a state?
Well, on that question of the state or not a state of Palestine, you've been a longtime supporter of a two-state solution, and you've also been critical of those in the BDS movement who support one binational state, citing, among other things, public opinion. I'm wondering if I could get a reaction to the recent piece in the New York Times by Peter Beinart, who a mainstream voice who certainly was at one point, calling for one binational state. Has public opinion started to shift on this issue, and has your opinion changed?
In my opinion, there's no basis, given the current balance of political forces, for a one-state solution to Palestine. I don't see any forces in the global scene that are responsive, that can be made responsive to that political demand. I do see quite a lot of global support, though obviously it's more verbal than, well, it's entirely verbal than action, but at least there is a willingness among the international community to entertain the idea of two states. I don't see any willingness to entertain one state. Now, secondly, BDS. BDS does not support a binational state. And we shouldn't try to prettify BDS by making it amenable or palatable to a Western audience. They support one state. If you take the spokesperson or chief spokesman for BDS, it's Omar Barghouti. So far as I can discern from what he's written, he supports one Arab state in which Jews have equal rights, but it's an Arab state. He's very adamant that Jews are foreign settlers, and as foreign settlers, they shouldn't be entitled to the same rights. It's not exactly the correct word, but they don't have the same entitlement to that land as the indigenous population. So he supports one Arab state in which Jews have equal rights, but it's not their state. Weinhardt's statement is important at a what you might call an ideological level. It means that Zionism, it indicates, it signifies that Zionism as an ideology is losing its sway among American Jews. That a divorce is happening. It's a protracted divorce, but anyone who knows about divorces know they can go on for years and years and years.
Yeah. And
one of the problems with divorces, of course, are settlement of community property or marital assets, as it's now called. So it's part of a process. It's another step in the process of the gradual alienation, estrangement, estrangement being also a divorce court term, estrangement of American Jews from Israel.
Right.
Forget about one state, even for two states. There's no one state or two state on the political agenda right now. The only thing on the political agenda is, one, the annexation. Two, it's still a possibility, in my opinion, though it's grown weaker. There's still a possibility of putting on the political agenda ending the inhuman, illegal, immoral blockade of Gaza, the criminal blockade of Gaza. That's an item on the agenda. And three, I would say a smaller item, but it's an item to mobilize around Israel's investigation, hopefully indictment, by the International Criminal Court. Those are political items on the agenda now in the foreseeable future. One state, two states. I agree with Hagai Elad. They are meaningless distractions.
Well, I wanted to get your thoughts on one political force, or someone who certainly was a political force at one time, and that's an old nemesis of yours, Alan Dershowitz. For those who aren't familiar, you debated him on Democracy Now! And exposed a book of his as being largely fraudulent and plagiarized, and then purely coincidentally, you happened to be denied tenure a couple years later. What's your reaction to his recent fall from grace in light of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein?
First of all, contrary to what one might suppose, I don't take any particular delight in it. What the German expression is Schadenfreude, to derive pleasure from somebody else's suffering, torment. I don't want to pretend to be above those passions. I am very far from above those passions. But there are a number of things to be said. First of all, the most important point for me is that Alan Dershowitz would have been nothing. He would have been an okay lawyer. I don't know how competent he is as a lawyer, but it said he's not a courtroom lawyer. He's an appeals lawyer. Appeals lawyers depend a lot on connections. He was very well connected, and so in appeals, he knew the right people to contact, the right buttons to press. He was a good appeals lawyer, I'm told. His public reputation, forget about the appeals court, his public reputation, that was made strictly by virtue of the fact of his pedigree. He was the senior-most professor, the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. And it was that pedigree that got him a forum, an audience in the public. Harvard made his reputation. Now, long before Jeffrey Epstein came along, and long before he was flacking for Donald Trump, the guy was a complete wretch. He was a pathological liar. I mean, there have been whole books written, including one by me, just chronicling the lies, the incessant, nonstop lying of this guy. Did that affect his reputation at Harvard? Did Harvard in any way publicly distance itself from anything he said? This nonstop lying, and not just lying on trivial matters. It was using his name in court when Palestinians were being tortured, and he, using his name and using his pedigree, to deny that Israel was engaging in torture. He's personally culpable by his actions for the torture of many Palestinians. Let's be clear about the facts. And I know the facts very well. Professor Dershowitz was never a civil libertarian lawyer, a civil liberties lawyer. That's all just nonsense. Every time he's introduced on any program, he's the famed civil liberties lawyer. Really? Can you show me this record of civil liberties? I have gone through everything he's written about his professional career, his two so-called autobiographies, which ought to be classified under the fiction label in the libraries, and everything else, the best defense, everything he's written. There's no record of support for civil liberties. Now, he has the right to defend if he wants to, but to classify it as a civil libertarian, a famed civil libertarian, I went through everything he's written. He said he did a little pro bono work for Angela Davis during her case, the black militant from the 1970s. She's still obviously active. He claimed, I don't know how much that is, and I never asked Angela Davis whether it was true, but he claimed, he might have written one, page, who knows. And then he claims a couple of other things he was involved in, little things. He doesn't make any big claims about being involved in the 60s litigations, and there were quite a few back then. The most famous lawyer of the time being William Consoler, deservedly so. So it's all a fraud. It's all a fake, this thing about civil liberties. You can see his commitment to civil liberties now. He's suing everybody for libel to try to stop, the case from proceeding.
It's good to see him get his comeuppance, but you wish it was maybe for the full scope of his misdeeds from over the years.
No, the misdeeds, I'm not going to trivialize it.
Yeah.
The misdeeds are real. And a woman or several women allegedly, I should say the alleged misdeeds, because I do have to wait for the evidence. I don't want to argue on that point. The alleged misdeeds are real, and the suffering of the victim, of the alleged victim, is real, and we shouldn't trivialize that.
Well, on that note, I'm sorry, we could go on for hours, but I want to thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Longtime follower of yours. Norman Finkelstein, thank you very much.
You're welcome.